They ruled kingdoms. They commanded armies. They were crowned by God himself. At least, that's what people believed. And yet, medieval kings were some of the easiest people in history to kill. Not because they were weak, not because they were stupid, but because the medieval world was quietly stacked against them in ways most people never consider. When we imagine medieval kings, we picture towering castles, endless guards, loyal knights, and absolute control. A man so protected that death could only reach him through grand betrayals or legendary assassinations. But the reality was far more fragile. Many medieval kings died not in glorious battles, but from infections, poisoned cups, poorly built staircases, angry mobs, careless servants, or diseases their own doctors helped spread. Some didn't even make it past their 20s. And what makes this truly unsettling is this. The very systems meant to protect medieval kings often made them more vulnerable instead. If that sounds strange, stay with me, because once you understand how medieval power actually worked, everything changes. And by the end of this video, you'll see why wearing a crown in the Middle Ages was less like wearing armor, and more like painting a target on your back. The great myth of medieval power. To understand why medieval kings were so easy to kill, we need to strip away the modern idea of power. Today, power is centralized. Governments have institutions, professional militaries, intelligence agencies, and systems that survive even when leaders fall. In the medieval world, power was personal. A king didn't rule through bureaucracy. He ruled through people, lords, knights, bishops, advisors, family members, servants, and every one of those relationships was fragile. If enough people decided to stop cooperating, or worse, decided you were expendable, your power collapsed instantly. A medieval king without loyal allies wasn't just weak, he was dead walking. This is why medieval history is filled with kings who ruled for only a handful of years, sometimes months, before meeting sudden and violent ends. And it's also why kings spent most of their reigns doing something surprisingly mundane, trying not to be murdered. No standing armies, no real security. One of the biggest misconceptions about medieval kings is that they were surrounded by permanent, elite protection. They weren't. There were no standing armies in the modern sense. No professional bodyguard units trained from birth to protect a head of state. No intelligence networks feeding kings warnings of imminent threats. A king's guard was usually a rotating mix of household knights, local nobles, and hired men whose loyalty depended entirely on payment, favors, or family ties. If money ran low, or political winds shifted, those guards could vanish overnight. Even worse, many of them were related to the very nobles plotting against the king. Imagine trusting your life to men whose cousins wanted your throne. That wasn't paranoia. That was daily medieval reality. This meant that kings often slept in unfamiliar castles, ate food prepared by strangers, and traveled constantly through territories where loyalty was flexible. And every journey carried risk. Travel was one of the deadliest things a king could do. Medieval kings couldn't rule from a single, secure capital the way modern leaders do. They had to move constantly. Why? Because power was local. If a king didn't physically show up, nobles might ignore his authority entirely. Taxes wouldn't be paid, laws wouldn't be enforced, rebellions would quietly grow. So kings traveled endlessly, from castle to castle, from monastery to city, through forests, mountain passes, and muddy roads where bandits, rebels, or rival lords could strike. And when a king traveled, his security became weaker, not stronger. Supply lines were thin. Medical care was non-existent. Food and water were taken wherever they could be found. A single contaminated well could kill a king without anyone lifting a sword. If this is already changing how you picture medieval royalty, it only gets worse from here. Medicine made kings easier to kill. Let's talk about doctors, or more accurately, medieval physicians. These men genuinely believed they were helping, but their understanding of the human body was disastrously wrong. Bloodletting, leeches, toxic herbal mixtures, balancing humors by draining the patient until they were weak and dehydrated. When a king fell ill, the response wasn't rest and hygiene, it was intervention. Aggressive, dangerous intervention. A mild infection could become fatal after repeated bloodletting. A simple fever could spiral into death because the king's own physicians weakened his immune system. Some kings survived battles only to be killed by their doctors days later. And unlike commoners, kings were treated more aggressively, not less, because physicians felt pressure to do something. Ironically, being important made treatment deadlier. The court was a breeding ground for betrayal. If the battlefield wasn't the most dangerous place for a king, the court certainly was. Medieval courts were small, crowded, unsanitary, and politically toxic environments. Everyone was watching everyone else. Everyone was whispering. Everyone wanted something. And the closer you were to the king, the more dangerous you became. Servants handled food and drink. Advisors controlled access. Family members stood directly in line for succession. This created a brutal truth. The people closest to the king had the most to gain from his death. Poisoning wasn't rare. It was expected. Kings ate knowing that a single meal could end their reign and their life. And while poison gets romanticized in fiction, the reality was far uglier. Many poisons worked slowly, painfully, and unpredictably. A king might suffer for days or weeks before dying, while no one could prove what happened. And even when suspicion was obvious, justice was rare, because accusing the wrong person could trigger civil war. If you're finding this unsettling, that's because it should be. This wasn't a stable system. It was a pressure cooker. Here's the part most people never realize. Medieval kings weren't fragile despite their power. They were fragile because of it. Their authority rested on personal relationships, ritual legitimacy, and constant visibility. Remove any one of those, and the king became vulnerable. Remove several, and death was almost inevitable. And we haven't even touched the most dangerous factors yet: religious politics, succession crises, civil wars disguised as justice, and the terrifying moment when a king's own people decided he was no longer chosen by God. In the next part, we're going deeper into how crowns didn't protect kings from violence, but actually invited it, and why some medieval kings survived battles only to be torn apart by their own subjects. If you're enjoying this breakdown so far, staying through the next section will completely change how you see medieval power. There was a moment, sometimes brief, sometimes painfully slow, when a medieval king crossed an invisible line. Before that moment, he was untouchable. After it, he was fair game. And the terrifying part is how quickly that shift could happen. A single military defeat, a bad harvest, a rumor whispered by the wrong priest. Suddenly, the king wasn't seen as God's chosen ruler anymore. He was seen as a mistake. When kings stopped being sacred, medieval kingship rested on one fragile idea: divine legitimacy. People didn't obey kings because they were strong. They obeyed them because they believed God wanted them to. But divine favor was conditional. If crops failed, if plagues spread, if armies lost battles, People didn't ask, "Did the king make a mistake?" They asked, "Has God abandoned him?" And once that question entered public thought, the king's life expectancy plummeted. Because killing a king chosen by God was a sin. Killing a king rejected by God was justice. Defeat was deadlier than any weapon in the medieval world. Losing a battle didn't just cost territory, it cost legitimacy. A defeated king was dangerous, not to his enemies, but to his own allies. Nobles began hedging their bets. Church leaders distanced themselves. Support quietly evaporated, because backing a losing king was a good way to lose your lands or your head. And here's the brutal truth. Many medieval kings weren't killed by their enemies. They were killed by former supporters who decided survival mattered more than loyalty. A king who lost too often became a liability. And liabilities were removed. Rebellions didn't look like rebellions. When we think of rebellions, we imagine banners, armies, and open war. Medieval rebellions were subtler and far more dangerous. They often began as legal challenges, or counsels, or advice. A group of nobles would claim they were protecting the realm from the king himself. They would say the king was being misled, that he was harming the people, that drastic action was required, and sometimes they were right, but the outcome was almost always the same. The king was imprisoned, safely guarded, protected, until he quietly died, from illness, from stress, from an accident, or from something no one ever officially recorded. Castles were traps, not fortresses. Castles are often imagined as the ultimate symbol of safety. Thick walls, high towers, defensive positions. But for kings, castles were often death traps, because castles were built for war, not for internal security. Once a king was inside, he was surrounded by servants, guards, and officials who all answered to someone else. And if control of the castle shifted, even slightly, the king was helpless. There were no escape routes, no secure communications, no rapid reinforcements. A locked gate could end a dynasty. And many did. Crowns didn't protect you from mobs. When royal authority truly collapsed, the danger became immediate. Because medieval cities were volatile places, crowded, poor, angry. If famine struck or taxes rose too high, resentment built fast. And if a king happened to be nearby when that resentment boiled over, there were no riot police, no crowd control tactics, no safe evacuations. A king caught in a city uprising could be dragged from his horse and beaten to death in minutes. And this wasn't rare. It happened again and again across medieval Europe. Once the crowd decided the king was the problem, nothing stood between him and violence. Succession made murder convenient. Here's another uncomfortable reality. Medieval succession laws were messy, often unclear, often contested, often violent. Brothers, uncles, cousins all had claims, and if a king died suddenly, disputes vanished. Murder solved political problems, which meant that kings lived surrounded by people who benefited directly from their death. This created a culture where assassination wasn't shocking, it was strategic, and it made trust almost impossible. Even victory could be fatal. You might think winning battles kept kings safe. Sometimes it did. But victory brought its own dangers. Victorious kings returned with spoils, prisoners, and political expectations. They had to reward allies, punish enemies, rebalance power, and every decision created resentment. Too generous, and rivals grew stronger. Too harsh, and rebellion brewed. There was no safe option. Every move risked violence. The psychological weight of the crown, one aspect that's rarely discussed, is the mental toll. Medieval kings lived under constant pressure. No privacy, no escape, no safety. They were watched, judged, and whispered about at all times. And stress kills, literally. Many kings died young, not from wounds, but from exhaustion, illness, and chronic stress made worse by brutal living conditions. The crown didn't just make them targets, it broke them. Why kings were easier to kill than you think by now, a pattern should be clear. Medieval kings weren't protected by systems, they were the system. And when people decided the system was broken, they removed the king. Violently, efficiently, sometimes quietly. In the next part, we're going to look at specific ways medieval kings died, from shockingly mundane accidents to horrifying betrayals that reshaped entire kingdoms. And once you see just how fragile their lives really were, you'll understand why medieval history is filled with sudden, brutal endings. If this is already shifting how you see medieval power, staying through the next section will make it impossible to ever romanticize kingship again. Part 3. The mundane, the miserable, and the absurd ways kings died. By now, it should be clear that medieval kings weren't dying heroic deaths on battlefields nearly as often as stories suggest. Many of them died in ways that were embarrassing, not dramatic, not glorious, just ordinary and deadly. Because despite their crowns, medieval kings lived in the same dangerous world as everyone else, and that world was constantly trying to kill them. Disease didn't care about crowns. The single greatest killer of medieval kings wasn't assassination. It was disease. There were no antibiotics, no germ theory, no effective treatments. A minor infection could spiral out of control in days. A bad tooth could become a death sentence. A small cut could turn septic. A fever could end a reign overnight. Kings lived in crowded courts, surrounded by servants, nobles, animals, and filth. Illness spread fast, and when it did, there was nowhere to hide. Medical care often made things worse. You might assume kings had the best doctors. They did. That was the problem. Medieval medicine was rooted in superstition, bloodletting, and dangerous theories about bodily humors. When a king fell ill, doctors responded aggressively. They bled him, they purged him, they starved him, all while his body was already weak. Treatments often accelerated death rather than prevented it, and because doctors were afraid to contradict one another or admit ignorance, fatal mistakes were repeated again and again. Being royal didn't improve your chances. It often reduced them. Food was a silent assassin. Royal diets were terrible. Kings ate rich, heavy foods constantly. Meat, bread, alcohol, sugar. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare at court. Clean water was unreliable. This led to obesity, gout, heart problems, and chronic illness. Gout alone crippled multiple medieval kings, leaving them unable to walk, ride, or fight. A king who couldn't move became dependent, and dependency made him vulnerable. Some kings didn't need enemies. Their own lifestyle was killing them. Accidents were shockingly common. Another uncomfortable truth: medieval kings died in accidents. A lot. Hunting accidents, falls from horses, boating mishaps, collapsing structures. Hunting was especially dangerous. Kings were expected to hunt aggressively to prove strength and masculinity. They rode fast. They chased wild animals. They used heavy weapons. One bad fall could shatter bones, and broken bones in the medieval world often meant death. There was no surgery, no infection control, no pain management, just agony and slow decline. Travel was a gamble. Kings didn't rule from one place. They traveled constantly, between castles, between cities, between battlefields, and medieval roads were brutal, muddy, narrow, dangerous. Carriages tipped, horses slipped, bridges collapsed. A king travelling through his own kingdom was never truly safe. Bandits, ambushes, and accidents all waited just beyond the castle gate. Even peace was dangerous. Poison was feared, but rarely proven. Poison looms large in popular imagination. And yes, some kings were poisoned. But here's the twist. Most suspected poisonings were never confirmed, because symptoms of poisoning looked exactly like symptoms of disease: vomiting, fever, weakness, organ failure. When a king died suddenly, rumors spread immediately. Was it poison? Was it God's judgment? Was it betrayal? No one could tell, and that uncertainty fed paranoia at court. Kings became suspicious, trust evaporated, fear ruled daily life. Sometimes the fear itself caused political collapse, long before poison ever did. Sleep was not safe, even rest was dangerous. Royal chambers weren't private sanctuaries. They were busy spaces filled with servants, guards, attendants, and officials. Kings were rarely alone, and that meant that even sleep was exposed. A blade in the dark, a pillow held too long, a mistake. Assassination didn't require armies, it required access, and kings were surrounded by people who had it. When kings became weak, they became targets. Perhaps the most important pattern is this: the moment a king appeared weak, physically or mentally, his danger multiplied. Illness sparked rumors. Injury invited plots. Old age encouraged impatience. Everyone knew the clock was ticking, and some people preferred to speed it up. Weak kings didn't die because they were weak. They died because weakness told others it was safe to act. The myth of the invincible king. We grow up imagining medieval kings as armored giants, protected by loyal knights and towering walls. But the reality was the opposite. They were soft targets, highly visible, heavily constrained, constantly watched, and most of them died not in epic moments, but quietly, painfully, and prematurely. In the next part, we're going to look at how fear shaped kings' behavior, and how attempts to stay safe often made things worse. Because medieval kings didn't just die easily, they lived knowing it, and that knowledge shaped every decision they made. If you're still with me here, you're already seeing medieval power very differently, and the next section pulls back the curtain even further. Part 4. Living on borrowed time. By this point, one truth should be impossible to ignore. Medieval kings didn't rule from positions of safety. They ruled from positions of constant danger. And the most dangerous part wasn't the battlefield. It was the throne itself. The paradox of power. Here's the cruel irony of medieval kingship. The more powerful you were, the more visible you became, and the more people wanted you gone. Kings were symbols, and symbols attract enemies. Every decision a king made, every law, every tax, every alliance, created winners and losers. And losers remembered. They whispered, they waited, they planned. A medieval king didn't need to make many enemies, just a few determined ones. Security was an illusion. Kings tried to protect themselves. They built thicker walls, surrounded themselves with guards, restricted access to their chambers. But none of it solved the core problem. You cannot isolate a king from the people who serve him. Someone must bring the food. Someone must guard the door. Someone must dress the king. Someone must sleep nearby. Absolute security would require absolute isolation, and that would destroy the ability to rule. So kings lived with compromise, and compromise created openings. Fear shaped every decision. Once you understand how vulnerable medieval kings were, their behavior suddenly makes sense. Why were some kings paranoid? Why were others cruel? Why did they execute rivals quickly and harshly? Because hesitation could be fatal. Mercy was risky. Delay was dangerous. Trust was a gamble. A king who waited too long to act might not live long enough to act at all. So many kings ruled harshly, not because they were evil, but because they were afraid. Afraid of betrayal, afraid of weakness, afraid of becoming the next quiet death whispered about in court, the lonely throne. Despite being surrounded by people, medieval kings were profoundly alone. They could not speak freely. They could not confide safely. They could not relax. Every smile might be fake. Every loyal gesture might hide ambition. Every illness might spark plotting. Imagine living, knowing that your decline would immediately trigger power struggles. Imagine knowing that your death, even accidental, could plunge a kingdom into chaos. That knowledge weighs on a person. It shapes them. When death came, it came. Fast, one of the most striking patterns in medieval kingship is how suddenly everything could end. A healthy king 1 week, dead the next. There were no warning systems, no preventative medicine, no emergency response. When things went wrong, they went wrong, fast. And when a king died unexpectedly, the consequences were enormous. Succession crises, civil wars, foreign invasions. Entire nations could unravel because one man slipped, fell ill, or trusted the wrong person. Why this still matters, it's tempting to see medieval kings as distant alien figures. But their vulnerability tells us something deeply human. Power does not equal safety. Authority does not guarantee control. Status does not shield you from reality. In many ways, medieval kings were prisoners of their own position, trapped by expectation, surrounded by danger, always one mistake away from oblivion. We often romanticize medieval rule, crowns, castles, thrones. But behind all of it was a simple truth. Being a medieval king was one of the most dangerous jobs in history. Not because they lacked power, but because they had too much of it. And that made them targets every single day. If you've made it this far, you now see medieval kings differently than most people ever will. And if you enjoy uncovering the hidden realities behind history's most powerful figures, that's exactly what this channel is about. There's much more to uncover.